Hello, my name is Lloyd. This is my first video. It is about 3 insights that I've had on the idea and the practice of learning enlightenment. I studied Buddhism as part of a Sangha for about 8 years. Sangha means community or spiritual community if you're trying to seem important. And I also studied other sort of spiritually led, guru led sort of self development stuff as well, and other meditation also. My first insight was that during a particular quality of consciousness that I used to get whilst meditating, I saw that enlightenment was a hindrance to that very quality of consciousness, and I felt like I had to maintain that quality of consciousness. I had to just let go of the idea of enlightenment so that I could stay in the moment. This wouldn't be a surprise to Buddhists, of course. They talk about giving up goals, and that enlightenment is one of the ideas that you have to give up to attain it. So this isn't a surprise, but it was, for me, it was quite a significant part of the process and the progress towards what I'm about to say about enlightenment. The second insight, which came quickly after the first and was partly because of the first as well, is that enlightenment by its own philosophy can only be a lie. Based entirely on its own philosophy, the words they're used to describe enlightenment are things like enlightenment transcends the use of concepts, cannot be described by words, things like this. Well, what are the words that are used therefore to describe it? Well, my preferred term for words that are knowingly inaccurate is lie. So I started to just see it as a lie. That helped me with the meditation that I was doing. It helped me stay in the present moment and all the rest of that sort of lovely Buddhist stuff that they like to talk about. Many Buddhist teachers like to consider themselves things like, we are the finger pointing at the moon, look at the moon, don't look at the finger, or some other obfuscation that doesn't really make any sense. This is really coming into the insight of the third insight, but yeah, they're just lies, and you might consider me to be harsh calling them lies, but it's in light of them being quite toxic and destructive of the beneficial psychological state or meditative state, that I was in. Seeing how it degraded that started to let me start to see it as quite toxic and difficult, and therefore it really did take on the position of a lie. And well, that's what it is in by its own philosophy. They are merely the finger. They're pointing at the moon, and they're actually talking about the moon, but that doesn't even make any sense, really. There are other analogies that escape my mind. If I could have a quick look at my notes, I'll have to look it up properly later. The third insight was a lot harder and took me a lot longer, and actually came only after I had quite a difficult interaction with a psychopath, or someone that I think to be a psychopath at least, and somebody else does as well. That is, that enlightenment isn't just a lie, but that it's a type of psychological trap. Now, there are many psychological traps that can be used, but there's one in particular that has been referred to as someone trying to make someone else bake a cake, for example, and not giving them all of the relevant things that they need to bake the cake. So you're being given an impossible task by an authority figure. The authority figure enforces their authority by trying to get you to do it. You are made inadequate, incapable, all sorts of negative emotions around the incapacity to fulfill this impossible task that you've been given. Well, imagine a task where you're being made to bake a cake, but cakeness does not exist. And that's where we have enlightenment. You are obtaining that which is not an obtainment, or transcending existence but you still exist, or transcending the self but still being who you are. All sorts of different absurd, nebulous contradictions that are used to describe enlightenment. They just express that this is the perfect form of the impossible task psychological trap. So that's why you end up with gurus claiming enlightenment. Maybe they are, who cares, that's irrelevant whether they are or not. Teaching people to do a thing that isn't a thing, and people trying to learn this thing that isn't learnable or a thing at all. So you get this dynamic, and I'll read some more of my notes and get back to you. So first off, I saw it as a hindrance, then as a lie that can be toxic. I finally came around to seeing that it's actually a psychological trap, and I call it a trap for a reason. You make a promise, you self-identify, you devote some of your effort and some of yourself to it. You have self-identified, you are yourself someone who is seeking that. And to admit that you were wrong, that can be difficult. And if you remove from yourself your attempt to do the task, then it's like, what do you have to fill the void of who you are? You know, you are someone who is trying to become enlightened, and then suddenly you haven't got that as a personal identification. Also, you've normally made a judgment of the person you're learning it from, and you'll have to admit that that was wrong. And that can be hard as well, because, you know, you like to trust your judgment even if someone was playing tricks on you, or using other forms to make themselves seem legitimate that you know, that they weren't. Like a salesperson copies your body language to suggest that there's some sort of empathy between you, and that's false. But then you might buy that thing, admitting to yourself afterwards that you only bought it because the salesperson used this deceitful technique to trick you into thinking that you had a bond. That's difficult, you know. That's a hard thing to admit to yourself. That's why it's a trap. You're trapped in this sense of a personal commitment that you've made, a bond that you've made. I went to the place in Hereford which does Vipassana meditation, and they get you to sign a contract at the beginning promising that you'll do this and you'll do that. And it's a well-known technique of cults to get you to make agreements that then cause you to have to build an identity around the fact that you've made those agreements. Like it causes a cognitive dissonance that you then have to write back into your personality that that's someone that you are. So there's lots of psychological traps, but this is the main one to do with enlightenment, is that it is the impossible task that you are dedicating yourself to. It's hard to give up, and the person who is giving it to you, well, they gain a position of authority and power. They've taken on this mantle of the person who sets the task, and you're inevitably endlessly in their debt because you are incapable of fulfilling the task, and therefore you are become inadequate in relation to them. That bolsters their power. Anyway, we'll see where my notes take us next. Well, they quite neatly take us on to the fact that this is where the lineage teaching idea comes from in Buddhism. Why would a philosophy that teaches the transcendence of the self and the non-attachment of self also simultaneously teach that the teacher is very important and who taught you is very important? These strange contradictions always sort of played in my mind. This is unusual. This isn't something Well, it's not something I got into when I was studying Buddhism. I always found it very uncomfortable. It makes sense in the context that you are being taught to be a victim of a psychological trap that makes you dependent upon the teacher's authority. So the teacher becomes incredibly important to your spiritual practice. Therefore, your lineage is the most important thing. And yeah, there you go. That's why there's lineage in Buddhism. It's because there's a toxic psychological trap in the idea of enlightenment itself. The act of teaching it contradicts what it is that you are teaching. You're teaching transcendence of self, but then attachment to this personhood of a self who is your teacher. It's, yeah, there it is. What can I say? So, you have a teaching that's all about transcending ego, but the act of teaching it means that ego is intensified and egotism is concreted into the reality of those people's minds. So, well, now I personally think that that's an act of abuse in and of itself. I mean, what is legally understood to be abuse generally starts to happen from this point onwards. I think that getting there is an act of abuse. Who would use this? Who would use this trap? Well, I've got a few examples and I can go through them for you. I think that Osho is a perfect place to start with his ridiculous number of white Rolls Royces and his substantiated claims to have had sex with the most number of women. I mean, he probably did, and well, he was an ex-philosophy lecturer, and I heard a talk that he gave where he basically described some metaphysical ideas. Some guy came to him with a problem and he pointed out that the problem in and of itself was a thing, and the guy's mind was blown. You could hear him on the tape. He was like, whoa, like, wow, man. And it was just, and then Osho went on to describe to people that they shouldn't study philosophy, and it's like, that's metaphysics. You just described metaphysics to people, or a very small amount, without using metaphysical terms. You just described a metaphysical idea to people, their minds are blown, then you're telling them, don't study philosophy, only come to me. It's hard. It's hard not to take that seriously after you've sat through a tape where it's like, oh, okay, that's pretty clear what you're doing there. And then he went on to own hundreds of white Rolls Royces. I think there was more, we're talking triple figures. And he just, had several sexual partners every day of women who aren't clever enough to know that that's basic metaphysics, not even complex metaphysics. I mean, described in such a way that people who wouldn't normally understand philosophical ideas would then be able to understand it. It's a living. I just, it's cynical, it's obviously false, but, he seemed to enjoy his life. I don't think he should have, but, he did. Also, I would say the next one that I would mention on the list is Sangharakshita of the Triratna movement that used to be called, the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. He had lots of sexual partners commit suicide, and also he was teaching them enlightenment and Buddhism generally, and some other other versions of Buddhism, some stuff he came up with himself that was maybe look into it and, it would sit uncomfortably with you, but, that happened. I don't think that was random that so many people committed suicide after he'd, used them. I would say used would be the best word for it. I'll have a quick look to see who's next in my list. Next in the list is Sai Baba. He's quite famous for being able to produce earth I don't know if I went to a sleight of hand class, maybe dust would be the first thing you'd start learning. You know, I mean, if you had a little ball, maybe that would be what you'd start hiding and reappearing. But you know, he'd get dust to fall out of his sleeve, and then he'd get some oil and he'd massage some people's genitals with it. I don't know. It's whatever floats your boat. The most boring one, of course, is Eckhart Tolle. Yeah, he just wrote a few self-help books and lived the life of a fairly rich and influential person. Nothing special, really. Quite an unimaginative way of taking advantage of claiming that you're enlightened and having people believe you. You know, you'd think he'd do something special, but no, just be rich. Well, you know, being rich isn't bad, is it? Now, I imagine that there would be a lot of people out there claiming that they might hear about enlightenment as an idea and try to practice it themselves and possibly obtain it somehow and not have a teacher and maybe never even teach it because, you know, the act of teaching it inherently means that you're teaching someone to do an impossible task and therefore they will then treat you like a superior person, and there's this whole this toxic dynamic inherently comes from that process. So maybe, you know, people might be talking, oh, you can do it without that toxic process happening at all by just not teaching it and not learning it from a teacher. And to that I wrote a little joke. So you know it's a joke, and I think it's a joke, so I think it's hilarious. But yeah, if someone gets enlightened in a bedsit in Stoke and nobody ever hears about it, does it make a sound? There's a little bit of Zen there, because that's the structure of a Zen koan, and it doesn't make sense either, which is, you know, what Zen's supposed to be, I suppose, if you simplify it down a little bit. I kind of want to talk about the position of the victims of this psychological trap for a second. Now, I said at the beginning of the video that I had an interaction with a psychopath. Now, that psychopath tried to habituate me into being subordinate to them. Cults are famous for trying to play games where the person in the cult takes on an authoritative position, and that you're trying to then play a game where they're basically the referee and they're telling you whether you're good or bad. You get habituated over time towards seeing them as an authority figure, and yeah, you are then structured. You become not just, well, in a way habituated, yeah, to desire their good judgment, to desire their saying well done or that's good, and to be really hurt by them saying that's bad, or, you know, giving you a derogatory response. So yeah, they replace the sort of parents, and it's normally people with bad parental relationships or personal relationships who are seeking this, who are vulnerable to this happening. So yeah, this happened. Someone tried to do this to me. I witnessed them trying to do it to me, and it was like I was very offended at the time. But it obviously didn't have its effect because I saw it happen, and whatever. I then came into contact with somebody else who seemed to have not seen it happen when it happened to them some 8 years ago, I think was the length of time that they mentioned. And they even appeared to have some PTSD after it, because they're really stressed and unable to discuss what happened to them. Now, if someone's using techniques that are trying to go to your subconscious and not deal with your conscious self, they're trying to sort of habituate you in a way that you don't realize. Once you've been habituated, you're likely to do things that they tell you to without question or without understanding. And even if there's stuff that you don't want to do, you just do it because you're just like programmed, literally programmed to. When this is happening, it's traumatic, and it's hard to pick apart the fact that these people or this person played that game on you all that time ago. It's hard to remember that it happened. It's hard to pick apart how it came. It's something that happens to your subconscious, so you don't directly remember the method of it. Getting over that is hard. It's like, you know, you can't like, oh, I don't want to do what that person tells me to do anymore. But you're habituated to. It's like, you know, what can I say? It could give you PTSD because you'd come to be aware of this maliciousness in someone that you may previously not been aware of happening. I mean, you can't play these games on people and not see them as lesser humans than yourself. That's my own view. I mean, another technique that this particular person uses is they like to change the words that people use back at them. So they'll take if out of sentences generally. That's what it normally looks like, is that they normally take if out of a sentence. If someone does that 3 or 4 times, your words have been removed from yourself. They've become disassociated with you, and there's this sort of idea in the conversation that represents you or comes supposedly from you, but it's not you, and that distance makes it hard for you to then bridge that gap psychologically back into the conversation that's going on. And it's a really pernicious way of silencing people. And I've seen them do it several times. I've seen them do it just as a matter of course. It's just how they behave as a person. You can't respect someone and do that to them. It's like respecting someone, robbing them of their capacity to participate in a conversation. Nah, using subconscious division, you know. Nah, you know, that's evil in a way, but you know, it happens. And it's best that people are aware. Learn to be aware that these things go on. You may have to be a better person, literally, but yeah, it would be a better world. But you know, I don't want to get into talking about living in a better world. That's kind of dangerous. Anyway, I've got more notes. I'm going to read them and get back to you. Okay, so it seems that we've got to the end actually, and I just want to tell you about my future videos that I'm hoping to make. I haven't made them. I've written out scripts that I'm going to have to just ignore like I did on this one. But yeah, they're about economics, evolution, equality, and the eternal. The last one's a stretch because I just like the alliteration of, you know, economics, evolution, eternity. Well, you know, I should have an E one. I'll change it to E. I'll, you know, call it the eternal. Yeah. I'll get into that when we get into that. I'll leave that sort of, I don't want to put anyone off listening to any other videos between now and then, because it might sound a bit weird if I went into it just straight. Obviously, I was someone who did a lot of meditation, so, you know, I've, yeah, got a sort of spiritual streak, I should say. Yeah, oh yeah, and the next one I'm hoping to do is evolution. It's going to be a truth, because I'm thinking about going into being a bit more clickbaity. So it's going to be debunking equality, a truth about evolution, yeah, probably a truth about economics as well, yeah, and just the eternal. I don't know, I'm not debunking or anything, that's really about my mindset, I suppose. But yeah, there we go. Thank you for watching. If you watched this far, I suppose I'm supposed to say subscribe and like and comment, and I'm sure I'll maybe read some of them and get back to you, and maybe in a future date make a video responding to some, because I'm dyslexic and I don't type too well, so who knows. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.